I was halfway through a late shift at the base when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Nothing unusual about that. Most messages I get during duty hours are short and practical. Schedules, check-ins, the kind of stuff that doesn't require emotion. I stepped into a quiet corner, glanced at the screen, and saw my sister's name. The message wasn't long. "We've decided you need to move out. My son needs his own room." That was it. No greeting, no explanation, no question mark pretending this was a conversation. Just a statement already finalized delivered like a notice taped to a door. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't missing something. I wasn't. The words didn't change. "We've decided. Not can we talk, not we're struggling, not even I'm sorry." Just a decision made without me about a house I had been paying into for years. I typed a response. Deleted it. Typed another, deleted that too. For a moment, I stood there in uniform boots planted on polished concrete, thinking about how strange it was that I could be trusted with millions of dollars worth of equipment and the lives of sailors, but somehow didn't rate a conversation in my own family. The house wasn't something I'd just wandered into. 6 years earlier, when my sister was pregnant and overwhelmed, she'd asked if I could move in for a little while. I helped with the down payment. I paid nearly half the mortgage every month. When I deployed, I kept paying. When she took time off work after her son was born, I kept paying then too. We never sat down and made a big deal out of it because we were family. Or at least, that's what I thought at the time. Now the reason I needed to leave was that her son needed his own room. Not that the house was suddenly too small, not that finances were tight, just that I was the easiest variable to remove. I didn't reply. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. The habit was automatic. In the Navy, you don't react on impulse. You gather facts first. Emotional responses are for later if they're useful at all. Still, I'd be lying if I said it didn't hit hard. Not because I was afraid of moving out. I could afford my own place. That wasn't the issue. The issue was the way it was done. The way I was reduced to an inconvenience with no vote in a decision that directly affected my life. As I walked back onto the floor, I replayed the message in my head. We've decided. I kept wondering who we was. My sister, obviously. Maybe our parents. Maybe just her using the plural to make it sound bigger and more final than it really was. Either way, the message was clear. I was no longer considered part of the household. Or maybe I never had been. Later that night, when my shift ended, I sat in my car for a few minutes before driving off. I pulled the phone back out and read the text again. Same words, same tone. I started to type one last time, something polite, something careful, something that would keep the peace. Then I stopped. I erased the draft and put the phone face down on the passenger seat. At that point in the story, I need to pause for just a second. If you've ever been pushed aside by someone who should have had your back, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me what went through your mind in that moment. And if you're following along and want to hear how this plays out, subscribing helps more than you think. I drove home in silence. The house looked the same as always when I pulled into the driveway. Lights on in the living room. My sister's car parked in its usual spot. Nothing on the outside suggested that I'd just been quietly evicted by text message. I walked in, set my keys down, and went straight to my room. The room my nephew apparently needed so badly. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. My dresser, my deployment bag in the corner, the framed photo from my last promotion ceremony on the desk. I'd lived in tighter spaces than this. I'd lived out of a sea bag for months at a time. The room itself wasn't the point. What stuck with me was how clean the decision had been. No mess, no argument, no discomfort for the person making it. I didn't confront my sister that night. She didn't bring it up either. We passed each other in the kitchen like nothing had happened. She asked if I wanted leftovers. I said no. That was the extent of it. Lying in bed later, I stared at the ceiling and thought about all the times I'd adjusted my life to make hers easier, the deployments scheduled around family needs, the weekends I drove her son to activities so she could rest, the mortgage payments that went out automatically every month without discussion. None of that had earned me a seat at the table. By morning, the shock had worn off, replaced by something quieter and more focused. I wasn't angry yet. Anger would come later, maybe. What I felt instead was clarity. If my sister thought this was simple, she was right about one thing. It was simple, just not in the way she imagined. I got dressed, put on my uniform, and headed back to the base. The text stayed unanswered, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew exactly what not to say. I wasn't going to argue over text. I wasn't going to beg for space in a house I had helped pay for. And I wasn't going to let a decision made without me define how I moved forward. By the time I reached the gate, I'd already started running through numbers in my head. Not emotionally, practically. Dates, payments, records. Things that don't care about tone or family pressure. Things that don't respond to guilt trips. My sister thought she'd sent a message about a bedroom. What she'd actually done was force me to stop assuming I belonged somewhere I was only being tolerated. And once that assumption was gone, everything else shifted with it. I pulled into the base parking lot and sat there longer than usual, the engine still running, staring straight ahead, while the numbers I'd been turning over in my head refused to slow down. Not emotions. Numbers, dates, payments, habits, patterns. The kind of things that don't lie even when people do. On the surface, my sister's text looked sudden. Out of nowhere. A clean decision made overnight. But once I stopped reacting and started thinking, it didn't feel sudden at all. It felt overdue, like the final move in a game that had been going on quietly for years while I pretended not to notice. 6 years earlier, when Danielle told me she was pregnant, she sounded terrified. She was newly separated, barely covering her bills, and living in a rental she already couldn't afford. I was stationed nearby and had just re-enlisted. She asked if I could help her buy a place. Not co-own it. Just help. Family helps family. That was the phrase she used. I wired the money for the down payment without hesitation. I didn't ask for paperwork. I didn't ask for guarantees. I'd just gotten a bonus from a deployment, and she needed stability. It felt simple at the time. When she asked if I could move in for a year or so to help with expenses and be around when the baby arrived, I said yes without thinking twice. That year turned into 2, then 3, then more. Each time I asked casually if she wanted to revisit the arrangement, she'd wave it off. Everything was fine. We were making it work, no rush. I paid my share of the mortgage every month, sometimes more when she was short. When I deployed, I kept paying. When she cut her hours after my nephew was born, I covered the difference. It never felt like leverage. It felt like being responsible. The shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in, slowly enough that I could explain it away if I wanted to. At first, it was small comments. You don't really need the bigger room, right then scheduling things without checking with me. Family dinners planned on nights I was on duty. My sister referring to the house as my place instead of our place, even though my money had helped keep it standing. When my nephew was old enough to notice things, the tone changed again. Suddenly, every decision was framed around what was best for him. Which sounds reasonable until you realize how often that phrase gets used to shut down any other perspective. I wasn't resentful. That's the part people get wrong when they hear this story. I wasn't sitting around keeping score. I told myself this was normal, that this was what family looked like when one person didn't have kids and the other did. You adjust. You step back. You don't make things about you. The problem with that logic is that it trains people to see you as optional. By the time my sister's text arrived, I'd already been living in the margins of that house for a while. I came and went around her schedule. I kept my things contained. I made myself easy, and like anything that's easy, it stopped being appreciated. What hit me hardest wasn't the request to move out. It was the certainty behind it. The assumption that I wouldn't push back, that I would read the message sigh and start packing, that whatever I felt about it didn't matter enough to slow the process down. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was my mother. I didn't answer. I knew what the call would sound like. I'd heard versions of it before, just never aimed at me this directly. She'd tell me my sister was overwhelmed, that being a single parent was hard, that my nephew needed space, that I was strong and adaptable and would land on my feet. None of it would be wrong, and all of it would miss the point. By the end of the day, the family version of events had already taken shape without my input. Danielle was stressed. The house was too crowded. The decision had been made out of necessity, not malice. That's how it would be framed. Clean, practical, unemotional. The fact that no one had thought to talk to me first would be brushed off as an oversight. The fact that my financial contributions were suddenly invisible would be treated as irrelevant. And if I objected, I'd be the one making things uncomfortable. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me cautious. That night I sat down with my laptop and pulled up my bank statements. Not because I was planning anything dramatic, because I wanted to see the timeline clearly. When the first payment went out, how consistent the amounts had been, how much of the mortgage I'd covered during my deployments. I matched those dates to old emails and text threads, the casual messages, where my sister thanked me for helping keep things afloat. There were more of those messages than I remembered. I also noticed what wasn't there. No discussion of ownership, no acknowledgement that the arrangement had evolved beyond temporary. The longer it went on, the more it seemed everyone had quietly agreed that the house belonged to my sister, and I was just a guest who happened to contribute financially. It wasn't a conspiracy. That's important. No one sat down and planned this. It was something more common and more dangerous. Assumptions stacked on top of convenience, reinforced by my silence. The next morning, I found a sticky note on the counter. "We should talk tonight," my sister had written. No mention of the text, no apology, just an expectation that we'd smooth things over in person now that the decision was out in the open. I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. On my way out, I passed my nephew eating cereal at the table. He smiled at me, completely unaware that his need for his own room had just been used to redraw the boundaries of my life. I smiled back. None of this was his fault. And that made the situation harder, not easier. At work, I kept my head down and did my job. Meetings, briefings, the usual rhythm. No one there knew what had happened, and I didn't volunteer the information. I didn't need sympathy. What I needed was perspective. By the time I drove home that evening, I wasn't replaying the text anymore. I was replaying the years that led up to it. The small concessions, the assumptions I'd let stand, the moments I'd told myself weren't worth addressing. My sister wanted to talk. I knew that. She expected a conversation that would end with her feeling justified and me feeling guilty. I also knew that whatever I said in that conversation would set the tone for everything that followed. I parked the car, shut off the engine, and sat there for a moment longer than necessary, weighing one simple question that I hadn't asked myself before. Not whether I could afford to leave, but whether I was willing to keep pretending this was just family drama instead of a line that had already been crossed. I stepped out of the car and left my phone on the seat, deciding I wasn't ready to talk yet. Not to my sister and not to anyone else who might try to explain her decision for her. Inside the house, the TV was on, the volume just loud enough to fill the room without anyone really watching. It felt like noise meant to avoid silence. At work, my days were structured. Clear chains of command. Expectations spelled out. If a decision affected someone, you talked to them first. That wasn't kindness. That was professionalism. You didn't blindside people and call it leadership. In uniform, people knew my role. I planned operations. I signed off on equipment worth more than that house. When something went wrong, it landed on my desk, and I owned it. No excuses, no hiding behind someone else's needs. Accountability was the baseline. At home, none of that seemed to matter. I set my bag down and walked into the kitchen. My sister was standing at the counter, scrolling on her phone like nothing had happened. She looked up and smiled, the kind of casual smile you give when you assume the hard part is already over. "Hey," she said, "we should probably talk later." I nodded. "Later," I said, and poured myself a glass of water. The contrast hit me harder than I expected. 12 hours earlier, I'd been briefing junior officers who trusted me to make decisions that affected their safety. Now I was being managed like an inconvenience who needed to be eased out without friction. That night, after my sister went to bed, I sat at the small desk in my room and opened my laptop again. Not because I was spiraling, because this was what I did when things didn't add up. I gathered information. I pulled up my LES statements, deployment pay, housing allowances. I cross-checked them with my bank records. Everything matched. Clean. Predictable. I wasn't reckless with money. I wasn't dependent on my sister. If anything, the opposite was true. And yet, the way the decision had been delivered implied I was somehow the one being accommodated. Like my presence was a favor that had simply run its course. I thought about how often that assumption had shown up in small ways. When relatives asked where I lived and my sister answered for me. When people joked that I was basically a guest since I was gone so much. When my schedule was treated as flexible because I didn't have a child waiting at home. None of it had seemed malicious at the time. It felt like background noise, the kind you learn to ignore. The Navy trains you to separate signal from noise. To pay attention when patterns repeat. Sitting there looking at my own financial records, it became clear that this wasn't about space. It was about roles. My sister saw herself as the homeowner and the parent. I was the helper, useful until I wasn't. The next morning, I put on my uniform and left early. On the drive to base, I passed rows of houses that looked just like ours. Same size, same layout, same number of rooms. Families made different choices about how to use that space. Some managed, some adapted, some talked things through. We hadn't done that last part. At work, the day moved fast. Briefings, emails, decisions stacked on top of each other. I handled them the same way I always did. Directly, efficiently. No drama, no second-guessing. During lunch, one of the sailors on my team mentioned she was moving out of her sister's place. Family stuff, she said, rolling her eyes. You think it'll be fine until it's suddenly not. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. The sentence landed exactly where it needed to. By the time my shift ended, I'd stopped feeling embarrassed about the situation. That had surprised me. I'd expected shame to creep in, the quiet kind that asks why you didn't see this coming sooner. Instead, I felt detached, like I was evaluating a scenario that just happened to involve my own name. That detachment was useful. When I got home, my sister was waiting in the living room. She gestured for me to sit. I stayed standing. I know the text was abrupt, she started. But you know how hard things have been. He's getting older. He needs his own space. I listened without interrupting. She talked for a while. About stress, about routines, about how this would be better for everyone in the long run. She never mentioned the money. She never mentioned how long I'd been paying into the house. She spoke as if the arrangement had always been temporary, even though we'd never set an end date. When she finally paused, she looked at me like she expected agreement. I hear what you're saying. I told her, but this isn't something you get to decide without me. Her expression shifted just slightly. Surprise. Maybe irritation. It's my house, she said, not aggressively. Matter of fact. That sentence told me more than everything else she'd said combined. I nodded once. Okay. She seemed relieved by that, like the conversation had gone the way she expected, like I'd accepted my role and would quietly start making arrangements. I went back to my room and closed the door. Later, lying in bed, I thought about how often I'd heard people say that the military hardens you, that it strips away softness. The truth is more complicated. It teaches you where to apply pressure and where not to waste energy. This wasn't a situation that would be solved by arguing, or by explaining my feelings, or by reminding my sister of everything I'd done. None of that would change how she saw the house or my place in it. What would matter were facts, documentation, the kind of details that don't care about tone or family narratives. I rolled onto my side and stared at the wall, not feeling angry or hurt anymore, just focused. At work, when something threatened the stability of a system, you didn't react emotionally. You assessed risk. You identified leverage. You protected your position. By the time I turned off the light, I wasn't thinking about where I'd live next. I was thinking about how decisions get made and who actually has the authority to make them. My sister thought she'd closed a conversation. From where I was lying, it felt more like she'd opened something she hadn't bothered to understand. I woke up before my alarm and lay there listening to the house settle the soft creaks and hums that come from a place you think you know well enough to stop paying attention to. I got dressed quietly, pulled on my uniform, and left without running into anyone. That suited me just fine. I didn't need another conversation framed as a courtesy. By mid-morning, the phrase from my sister's text had already lost its emotional weight and turned into something else entirely. My son needs his own room, needs his own. The more I thought about it, the less it held up. The house hadn't changed. The number of bedrooms hadn't changed. What had changed was my usefulness. At lunch, I pulled out my phone and checked a local real estate site out of habit more than intention. That's when I noticed the listing history. Our address didn't show up as active, but there were archived views, price estimates, comparables pulled within the last month. Someone had been researching options. Recently. I scrolled back through my messages with my sister looking for anything I might have missed. A casual comment from 2 weeks earlier caught my eye, thinking about long-term plans for the house she'd written. I'd replied with a thumbs up and told her we could talk when I was back from duty. We never did. The pieces didn't click all at once. They lined up. That afternoon, while waiting on paperwork, I checked my email and saw a notification I hadn't paid attention to before. A refinance ad addressed to my sister forwarded to the shared household email we'd set up years ago. The timestamp was from early morning, the day before the text. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. This wasn't about creating space for a child. This was about reshaping the house into something that didn't include me. When I got home that evening, the kitchen table was covered in mail. Not bills, flyers, mortgage offers, a glossy postcard from a real estate office 2 blocks away. I picked it up and turned it over. My sister's handwriting was on the back. A note to herself. Call Monday. She hadn't hidden it. She hadn't needed to. The assumption was that I wouldn't look too closely, or if I did, I wouldn't connect it to the text. I set the postcard down and washed my hands, letting the water run longer than usual while I thought through what I'd just learned. People lie in different ways. Some do it loudly, some do it by omission. My sister was doing the latter. She wasn't inventing a crisis. She was choosing the most convenient explanation and letting it do the work for her. At dinner, she talked about her son's school, his schedule, how fast he was growing. She mentioned needing to reorganize the house to make things easier. She didn't look at me when she said it. Easier for who I asked. She hesitated, then smiled. You know, everyone. I nodded and took another bite already done with the conversation. Later in my room, I opened my laptop and pulled up the shared utilities account. My name was still on it. So was hers. The same with the internet. The same with the insurance paperwork I'd helped organize when she moved in. My fingerprints were everywhere, even if my name wasn't on the deed. That mattered. What mattered more was the timeline. The refinance inquiries, the market research, the text. All of it pointed in the same direction. The decision to have me move out hadn't been triggered by a sudden need for space. It had been triggered by planning. I wasn't angry, not yet. What I felt was a strange sense of relief. There's something clarifying about realizing you're not dealing with a misunderstanding. Misunderstandings can be fixed with conversations. Plans require a different response. The next day, my mother called again. This time I answered. She didn't waste time. Your sister says you're upset. I'm not upset, I said. I'm paying attention. There was a pause. Then the familiar pivot. She's just trying to do what's best for her son. I understand that, I replied. But that doesn't mean I disappear without a discussion. She didn't mean it that way, my mother said quickly. Maybe not. Or maybe meaning had very little to do with it. After the call, I sat in my car and wrote down everything I could remember about how we'd gotten to this point. Dates, conversations, payments. The moments when I'd chosen not to press an issue because it seemed easier to let it go. The list grew longer than I expected. That evening, my sister asked if I'd started looking for a place. Not yet, I said. She nodded, satisfied. Well, just let me know. We should try to keep this smooth for him. There it was again. The shield. Her son. Not malicious. Effective. I didn't argue. I didn't challenge her story in that moment. Instead, I did what I should have done a long time ago. I stopped assuming good intentions were enough to protect my interests. The next morning, I took a personal day. I didn't tell anyone in the family. I drove to a coffee shop near the courthouse and pulled up public records on my laptop. Property records. Mortgage filings. The information was straightforward. My sister was the sole name on the deed. That part I already knew. But the mortgage history showed something else. Multiple payments made from my account over the years. Not loans, not gifts. Direct transfers tied to the mortgage number. I saved copies. From there, I checked emails. Old ones. The casual thanks for covering this month messages. The ones where she acknowledged I was helping keep the house afloat. None of it had been formalized, but it was documented. By the time my coffee went cold, the story had shifted again. This wasn't about whether I could be pushed out. It was about whether that push would happen without consequences. That night, as I pulled into the driveway, my sister was on the phone in the living room. I caught the end of the conversation as I walked past. Yes, that should work, she said. Once she's out, it'll be easier. She froze when she saw me. I'll call you back, she told whoever was on the other end. We stood there for a moment, the silence thick enough to make her uncomfortable. Everything okay? I asked. She forced a laugh. Yeah, just planning stuff. I nodded and headed down the hall, my mind already moving past her explanation. In the Navy, there's a moment in every operation where you realize the situation is different than the briefing suggested. That's when you stop following the script and start responding to reality. As I closed my door, I wasn't thinking about bedrooms or moving boxes. I was thinking about how quickly people rewrite the past when they think you won't challenge them and how fragile that confidence becomes once you start asking the right questions. I didn't bring up what I'd overheard in the living room. I didn't ask who she'd been talking to or what "once she's out" meant. I went to bed, set my alarm, and got up the next morning like nothing had changed. That wasn't denial. It was a choice. At work, staying quiet isn't weakness. It's discipline. You don't announce every move. You don't telegraph your position before you understand the terrain. You observe. You prepare. You decide when to speak. So I stayed quiet. I stopped discussing the house with my sister entirely. No questions. No arguments. No reassurance that I'd be easy about it. I let her assume I was processing things emotionally, that I needed time to accept what she'd already decided. That assumption worked in my favor. Instead of reacting, I shifted into preparation mode. The first thing I did was separate noise from facts. Family opinions were noise. Feelings, expectations, guilt, all noise. Facts were concrete. Documents, numbers, records. Those mattered. Every evening after work, I sat at my desk and went through years of statements. I wasn't looking for drama. I was building a clean timeline. When I paid, how much, for what? I labeled files clearly and backed them up. No exaggeration, no commentary, just data. I also stopped adjusting my schedule to accommodate the household. I cooked my own meals, did my own laundry. I didn't offer to help with errands or childcare, not out of spite, but because it was time to see how the system functioned without my invisible labor smoothing the edges. The change didn't go unnoticed. By the end of the week, my sister seemed more tense. Small things irritated her. She complained about bills, mentioned how exhausting everything was. I listened without engaging. She'd trained me for years to step in when things got uncomfortable. Removing that reflex shifted the balance faster than any argument would have. One night she knocked on my door. "I just want to make sure we're okay," she said, leaning against the frame. "You've been kind of distant." "I'm fine," I said, "just busy." She studied my face clearly, trying to figure out what that meant. I didn't offer her anything to work with. The truth was, I wasn't distant. I was focused. That weekend, I drove across town to meet with a housing counselor recommended by someone on base. Not a lawyer, not yet. I wanted information, not escalation. We talked through common arrangements, shared housing, informal contributions. What happens when one party assumes control without documentation? She didn't tell me what to do. She didn't need to. The patterns were familiar. "You're not the first person this has happened to," she said. "Usually it doesn't get addressed until it's already messy." "I'd like to avoid messy," I replied. She nodded. "Then staying calm is your best move." Back at home, the atmosphere kept tightening. My sister started bringing up deadlines. Not firm ones, just suggestions. "It would help if you had a plan by next month. We're thinking about rearranging soon." Each comment was delivered casually, but the pressure underneath was obvious. I didn't take the bait. Instead, I took another personal day and sat down with a civilian attorney who specialized in property disputes. I didn't tell her my whole story. I didn't need to. I asked specific questions. Hypotheticals. What mattered? What didn't? What carried weight if things ever moved beyond conversation? She listened, took notes, and answered plainly. "People assume silence means consent," she said. "It doesn't. But you do need to be deliberate about what you do next." I thanked her, paid for the hour, and left with exactly what I needed. Not a plan. A framework. That night my sister was unusually friendly. She cooked dinner, asked about my day, told me I could stay as long as I needed within reason. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. She sensed something had changed even if she didn't know what. I ate, cleaned my plate, and went back to my room. Alone, I allowed myself one moment of honesty. Not anger, not hurt, just acknowledgement. I'd wanted to believe that being the reasonable one would protect me, that avoiding conflict was the same as being respectful, that family bonds would fill in the gaps where paperwork didn't exist. That belief had run its course. The next morning, I made a decision that didn't involve my sister at all. I rerouted my paycheck into a new account, not to hide money, to create clarity. From that point on, every dollar I contributed would be deliberate and documented. When the utilities bill came in, I paid my portion and forwarded the receipt. No comment. When she asked if I could cover something extra just this once, I said no. Calmly, without explanation. She didn't argue. She didn't need to. Her frustration showed up in other ways. Shorter responses, sharper tone, the sense that something she thought she controlled was no longer moving the way it used to. At work, one of my peers noticed the shift. "You're quiet lately," she said over coffee. "Everything good, everything's clear," I answered. And for the first time since the text that felt true. The clarity changed how I slept, how I moved through the house, how I listened. I wasn't waiting for the next comment or demand. I was tracking behavior, patterns, reactions, the way my sister avoided specifics while pushing for outcomes. One evening, she mentioned she'd been talking to someone about the house again. So I asked. "Yeah," she said quickly, "just exploring options." I nodded and went back to what I was doing. From her perspective, my calm probably looked like acceptance. From mine, it was restraint. In the Navy, you don't escalate unless you have to. Escalation has costs. It attracts attention. It forces positions into the open before you're ready. Staying quiet buys time. Time to understand where you stand. Time to make choices instead of reacting to someone else's timeline. By the end of that week, I knew something important. My sister wasn't nervous because I might refuse to leave. She was nervous because she no longer knew what I was going to do. And uncertainty, especially when you've been operating on assumptions, has a way of making people show their hand. I shifted my chair closer to the desk and opened the folder I'd been building quietly for weeks. Nothing dramatic, no secret files, just records that told a very plain story if you bothered to read them in order. Dates, amounts, purpose, the kind of details that don't argue back. The attorney's words echoed in my head. Silence doesn't mean consent, but action without structure creates chaos. I wasn't interested in chaos. I wanted leverage that didn't rely on emotion or family pressure. I started by laying everything out chronologically. The down payment transfer, the first mortgage contribution, the months I covered the full amount during deployment, the utilities I'd paid when my sister's hours were cut. Each transaction was tied to the house, not to personal expenses. That distinction mattered. The picture that emerged wasn't complicated. I hadn't been a guest helping out temporarily. I'd been financially sustaining a property I had no legal protection in based entirely on trust. And now that trust was being treated as a liability, I should quietly absorb. The next step was uncomfortable but necessary. I scheduled a formal consultation with the attorney I'd spoken to earlier and brought the documentation with me. She didn't react emotionally. She didn't shake her head or sigh in sympathy. She read. She calculated. She asked clarifying questions. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair. "You don't own the house," she said plainly, "but your financial involvement gives you standing. Not automatic rights. Standing." I nodded. That was exactly what I needed to hear. Standing meant options. Options meant choice. She explained what those options looked like in real terms. Not internet myths. Not dramatic courtroom scenes. Practical outcomes. A demand for reimbursement. A mediation request. Formal notice that my financial contributions were not gifts. None of it required hostility. All of it required clarity. What happens if I do nothing I asked? She didn't hesitate. Then the story becomes whatever they say it is. I left her office with a single page of notes and a clear understanding of the terrain. No promises, no guarantees. Just a path that didn't depend on my sister's version of events. That night, I drafted a short, neutral email. No accusations, no threats, just facts. I stated that I was reviewing my financial contributions to the household and would be formalizing next steps. I didn't mention timelines. I didn't explain motives. I sent it to my sister and copied the household email account we both used. She responded within 10 minutes. "What does that mean?" she wrote. "It means I'm documenting things," I replied. Nothing more. The shift was immediate. The next morning she was unusually quiet. No casual comments, no reminders about moving plans. She avoided the kitchen when I was there. When she did speak, it was clipped careful. The confidence she'd had after sending that text was gone, replaced by something more cautious. 2 days later, she asked if we could talk. We sat at the kitchen table. No raised voices, no theatrics. She started by saying she felt blindsided, that she didn't realize I saw things so formally, that she thought we were family first. "I am," I said. "That's why I'm being clear." She frowned. "Clear about what? About what I've put into this house," I said, "and what that means now that I'm being asked to leave." She shifted in her chair. "I never said you had to leave immediately. You said I needed to move out," I replied. By text, without a conversation. That wasn't meant to be harsh. It was definitive. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I could see her recalculating. She wasn't angry, she was adjusting. "I don't want this to get legal," she said. "Neither do I answered. "Which is why I'm handling it properly." That was the moment something cracked. Not dramatically, quietly. The assumption that she could manage the outcome without engaging me directly was no longer holding. Over the next week, she started asking questions she hadn't asked before. About how long I planned to stay. About what I expected. About whether we could find a middle ground. Each question acknowledged something she hadn't wanted to say out loud before, that I wasn't just going to disappear. I kept my responses measured. I didn't give her a list of demands. I didn't argue about fairness. I told her I was consulting professionals and making decisions based on facts, not pressure. At work, the shift in my mindset carried over. I found myself less reactive in meetings, more deliberate. When someone tried to rush a decision without adequate information, I pushed back calmly. I realized I'd been practicing the same skill at home without naming it. One evening, I came home to find printed documents on the counter, mortgage statements, utility bills, a handwritten note from my sister asking if we could review everything together. I didn't touch them right away. I went to my room, changed out of my uniform, and then came back. We went through the papers line by line. She tried to frame some payments as shared living expenses. I pointed out which ones were tied directly to the house. She tried to minimize the amounts. I pulled up my records. There was no yelling. There didn't need to be. By the end of the conversation, she looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. Not stressed, exposed. "I didn't realize you were keeping track of all this," she said. "I didn't realize I needed to," I replied. That night I lay in bed and thought about how easily narratives form when one person assumes the other won't challenge them. How quickly those narratives unravel when facts enter the room. The next morning, I received a message from my sister that didn't mention bedrooms or timelines or what her son needed. It asked a different question entirely. "Can we talk about how to do this fairly?" I read it once, then set the phone down. From the outside, nothing had changed. I was still living in the same house, still going to work, still wearing the same uniform. But the balance had shifted. Not because I raised my voice, not because I threatened anything, because I stopped playing the role she'd assigned me and started acting like someone who understood where they stood. And once that happened, the conversation could no longer be controlled by the person who sent the first text. I let the phone sit on the counter for a full minute before picking it up, feeling the familiar weight of family pressure settle in without a single word being spoken. My sister's message hadn't demanded anything outright, but it had opened a door she clearly expected the rest of the family to walk through. They didn't waste time. By noon, my aunt had called. She didn't ask how I was. She asked why I was making things harder than they needed to be. "You know Danielle's doing her best," she said. "This doesn't need to turn into a whole thing." "It already is a thing," I replied. "I just didn't start it." That answer didn't land the way she wanted. I could hear it in the silence that followed. Later, my father called. His tone was calmer, practiced. He told me everyone was worried, that my sister felt attacked, that legal talk made people uncomfortable. He reminded me that family handled things internally. I said, "Internally means honestly." He sighed. "You've always been independent. You'll be fine. Danielle doesn't have that flexibility." There it was, the old hierarchy dusted off and reused. I was capable, adaptable, trained to endure. My sister had a child which apparently made her fragile by default, and me optional. I thanked him for calling and ended the conversation before it could slide into guilt. The messages kept coming. Cousins, family friends, people who hadn't asked about my deployments or my schedule or my finances in years suddenly had opinions about my tone, my timing, my attitude. No one asked what the text had felt like to receive. No one questioned why a decision that affected me had been made without me. The narrative was already set. I was escalating. I was overreacting. I was letting my military mindset turn a simple family matter into a conflict. I didn't respond to most of it. At work, the contrast was stark. When I brought an issue forward, it was evaluated on merit. When someone disagreed, they said so directly. There were rules, boundaries, respect for process. At home, emotion replaced structure, and whoever spoke loudest or first set the terms. That dissonance took a toll. I found myself staying later at the base, not because I had to, but because it was easier to be in a space where expectations were clear. When I did come home, the house felt tighter, like every shared space was now a negotiation. My sister noticed. "You're never around anymore," she said one evening, her voice edged with accusation. "I'm around," I replied. "I'm just not hovering." She crossed her arms. "Everyone thinks you're being unfair." "I'm being precise," I said. She shook her head. "This is tearing the family apart. That one almost got to me, not because it was true, but because it was designed to make me feel responsible for damage I hadn't caused." I went to my room and closed the door, leaning against it for a moment longer than usual. I wasn't angry. I was tired. There's a difference. Anger has energy. Fatigue comes from carrying weight that was never yours to begin with. That night, I seriously considered walking away without pushing further. I could afford it. I could find an apartment near base and be done with it. Let the money go. Let the story stand. Preserve whatever version of peace the family wanted to maintain. The thought didn't last. Walking away quietly would have reinforced the same pattern that put me here, the one where my contributions disappeared the moment they became inconvenient, the one where my silence was interpreted as agreement. I wasn't fighting for money anymore. I was fighting for accuracy. The next day, my sister sent another message. This one wasn't defensive, it was conciliatory. "I don't want us to be on bad terms," she wrote. "We should think about what this is doing to everyone." I read it twice and noticed what was missing. There was still no acknowledgement of how she'd handled the situation. No recognition of the text itself. No apology. I replied with one sentence. "I want us to be clear more than I want us to be comfortable." That evening, my mother showed up unannounced. She stood in the doorway of my room, taking in the packed boxes. I'd started organizing quietly. Not because I was leaving immediately, but because preparation felt better than waiting. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "I'm not doing anything," I replied. "I'm responding." She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at me the way parents do when they're trying to decide which version of their child they're speaking to. The strong one, the stubborn one, the one they can still influence. "You know how this looks," she said. "I know how it feels," I answered. She reached for my hand, then stopped herself. "Danielle's scared." "So am I said. "I just don't show it the same way." That was the closest I came to breaking. Not because I felt misunderstood, but because I finally understood something I'd avoided for a long time. Being the stable one doesn't protect you. It just makes you the easiest to push. After she left, I went for a run. Not to clear my head, to burn off the tension sitting in my chest. Mile after mile, I replayed the conversations, the assumptions, the way every appeal to family unity seemed to require me to give something up, while everyone else stayed exactly where they were. By the time I got back, I knew the cost of continuing down this path. Relationships would change. Some might not recover. People would choose sides even if they pretended not to. I would be labeled difficult by those who benefited from me being easy. That knowledge didn't stop me. The next morning, I forwarded my documentation to the attorney and asked her to prepare a formal mediation request. No threats, no accusations. Just a structured process that required everyone to sit at the same table with the same information. When my sister found out, she didn't yell. She didn't cry. She went quiet in a way that told me she was running out of angles. "This is going too far," she said. "This is as far as it needs to go," I replied. The family pressure didn't disappear after that. If anything, it intensified. But it also shifted. The questions changed. The certainty faded. People started asking what exactly I was asking for instead of why I was being so difficult. That shift mattered. I went to bed that night knowing I'd crossed an invisible line. Not one drawn by law or money, but by expectation. I was no longer the person who would absorb discomfort to keep everyone else calm. There was a cost to that. I could feel it in the distance, growing between me and people I loved. I could hear it in the way my name was used in conversations I wasn't part of anymore. But beneath all of that, there was something steadier. For the first time since the text arrived, the pressure I felt wasn't pushing me backward. It was forcing everything into the open, where it could finally be dealt with on equal ground. I slid the mediation notice across the kitchen counter and stepped back, choosing not to explain it out loud. The paper did the talking. Dates, names, a neutral location, a request for documentation from both sides. No accusations, no emotion. Just a process. My sister picked it up, scanned it once, then again, more slowly. Her jaw tightened. She didn't look at me. "You really want strangers involved?" she asked. "I want clarity," I said. She set the paper down like it might stain the counter. "This didn't have to be like this." "It already was," I replied and left for work. The days leading up to mediation felt compressed, like everything in the house was happening in narrower lanes. We moved around each other carefully. Conversations were short and practical. No one raised their voice. That made it worse, not better. Silence became strategic. At the base, my schedule filled up with briefings and checklists. I welcomed the routine. It kept my head clear. When you're trained to manage risk, you don't chase reassurance. You prepare. On the morning of mediation, I wore civilian clothes and drove to a small office near downtown. Neutral ground, beige walls, water pitchers on the table, a clock that ticked loudly enough to make people aware of time passing. My sister arrived with a folder thicker than mine. She looked confident, composed, like someone who expected the process to validate her version of events. Our parents came too, sitting close to her. They nodded at me, but didn't speak. The mediator introduced herself and explained the rules. One person speaks at a time. Stick to facts. No interruptions. The goal wasn't winning. It was resolution. My sister went first. She talked about being a single parent, about stress, about how the house felt crowded, about her son's needs. She framed the text as a misstep in communication, not a decision. She emphasized that I was capable and independent and would be fine. When she finished, she looked relieved, like she'd laid down the story she'd been telling herself and expected everyone else to accept it. Then it was my turn. I didn't talk about feelings. I didn't describe the shock of the message or the pressure that followed. I opened my folder and slid copies across the table. Bank statements, transfer confirmations, emails, dates aligned with mortgage payments. "I'm not disputing that you're a parent," I said calmly. "I'm clarifying my role in this house." The mediator asked questions. Neutral ones. How long had the payments been made? Were they consistent? Had there ever been a conversation about them being gifts? "No," I said. "They were contributions." My sister shifted in her chair. "That's not how I saw it. I'm not asking you to change how you saw it," I replied. "I'm showing how it functioned." The room changed. Numbers have a way of doing that. They don't respond to narrative. They just sit there solid and unbothered. My father leaned forward, squinting at the pages. "I didn't realize it was this much." "I didn't advertise it," I said. My mother looked between us unsettled. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "Because it worked," I replied, "until it didn't." The mediator turned to my sister. "Can you explain why the request to move out was made without discussing these contributions?" My sister hesitated. For the first time that morning, she didn't have an immediate answer. She started to say something about timing, about stress, then stopped. "It was easier," she said finally. That landed harder than anything else that had been said. The mediator nodded once and moved on. We talked options, reimbursement, timelines. What fairness could look like without pretending nothing had happened. My sister's confidence didn't disappear, but it shifted. She stopped speaking in generalities and started asking specific questions. About amounts, about expectations, about how long I planned to stay if an agreement was reached. The reason my son needs his own room never came up again. When the session ended, nothing was finalized. That wasn't the point. The point was that the story had been interrupted. The version of events that placed all urgency on me and all virtue on her no longer held the room. In the hallway afterward, my mother caught up to me. I didn't know she said quietly. I know I replied. My sister didn't approach me. She spoke briefly with the mediator, then walked past without eye contact. The folder in her hands looked thinner now. At home that evening, the air felt different. Not lighter, sharper. The house had absorbed what happened and was waiting to see how we'd move inside it now. My sister cooked dinner but didn't offer me any. I made my own and ate in my room. The distance was no longer subtle. It didn't need to be. Later, she knocked on my door. I didn't think it would go like that, she said. I did, I replied. She frowned. You made me look bad. I made things accurate, I said. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. Accuracy is hard to fight without admitting what you hoped would stay blurry. Over the next few days, small truths surfaced. She admitted she'd spoken to a lender, that she'd assumed my leaving would make the process cleaner, that she hadn't thought I'd challenge it because I never had before. None of it was shocking. What surprised me was how quickly the pressure reversed. Family members who had urged me to keep the peace now asked what resolution would look like. Not what I should give up, but what would be fair. At work, I was promoted to lead a new project, one that required decisiveness under scrutiny. I accepted without hesitation. The timing wasn't poetic, it was practical. I was doing exactly what I'd been trained to do, manage complexity without drama. At home, my sister started spending more time out of the house. Meetings, calls taken in the car. She was recalibrating, not apologizing, adjusting. One evening, she left a note on the counter. We need to figure out next steps. I folded it and put it in my pocket. The mediation hadn't ended the conflict. It had changed the terms. The house was no longer a place where assumptions ran unchecked. Every choice now had to pass through daylight. And once things are seen clearly, they don't go back to being convenient. I woke up to the sound of drawers opening and closing in the hallway, not slammed, just handled with unnecessary force. The house was still dark early enough that no one should have been awake. I stayed in bed listening. Footsteps moved back and forth. Cabinet doors. The low hum of irritation being worked out through motion. By the time I stepped into the kitchen, my sister was already dressed, phone pressed to her ear. I told you I needed more time, she said sharply, then noticed me and lowered her voice. I'll call you back. She ended the call and set the phone down like it had personally offended her. Everything okay, I asked? She didn't answer right away. She opened the fridge, closed it, then leaned against the counter. This has complicated things. It clarified things I said. She shook her head. You don't understand what you've done. I understand exactly what I did, I replied. I stopped pretending. Over the next few days, the consequences she hadn't planned for started stacking up. Not dramatically, quietly, the way real problems do. The lender she'd been talking to wanted updated financials. Without my ongoing contributions, the numbers didn't look the same. The refinance options she'd assumed were available suddenly weren't. Fees increased. Terms shifted. Calls that used to be returned quickly started going to voicemail. She complained about it openly, as if I were supposed to feel responsible. They're acting like the money just disappeared, she said one evening, pacing the living room. It didn't disappear, I replied. It stopped. That distinction mattered more than she wanted to admit. Family reactions shifted too. The calls slowed. The certainty drained out of conversations. People who had told me to just move on started asking careful questions instead. How much had I paid exactly? How long had there really been no discussion before the text? The answers didn't make anyone comfortable. My sister felt it most. She'd been operating on a shared understanding that she was in the right, that I would bend because I always had. When that understanding collapsed, she was left holding a version of events that didn't stand up well on its own. One afternoon, I came home to find boxes stacked in the garage. Not mine, hers. She saw me looking and crossed her arms defensively. "I'm just reorganizing." I nodded. That makes sense. She watched me carefully, waiting for a reaction. When none came, she turned away. Later that night, she knocked on my door again. "This isn't what I wanted," she said without preamble. "What did you want?" I asked. She hesitated. "I wanted things to stay simple." "For you," I said. She didn't deny it. The mediation follow-up arrived a week later. Proposed terms, reimbursement amounts, a timeline that didn't revolve around my sister's convenience. Nothing punitive, just balanced. She read through it in silence, then pushed the paper back across the table. "This is going to hurt," she said. "It already has," I replied. "We're just being honest about where." The change in her behavior after that was subtle but unmistakable. She stopped framing herself as the injured party. She stopped using her son as a shield in every conversation. She still wasn't apologetic, but the entitlement had cracked. What she lost wasn't just money. It was narrative control. She could no longer say, "I'd abandoned the family." The documentation didn't support it. She couldn't claim surprise. The timeline told a different story. She couldn't lean on the idea that I'd been a guest. Too many receipts said otherwise. Even my nephew noticed the shift. He asked why things felt tense, why his mom was on the phone so much, why I seemed calmer than before. I told him the truth in terms he could understand. Sometimes adults have to fix things they should have talked about sooner. He nodded and went back to his game satisfied. Kids don't need elaborate explanations. They need stability. At work, I finalized my housing application near the base. Not because I was being pushed out, but because I was ready to leave on my own terms. The unit approved it quickly. Clean record, stable income, no drama. When I told my sister I'd be moving, she looked relieved and resentful at the same time. When she asked, "When the paperwork is done," I said. She waited for me to say more. I didn't. The last family dinner before I moved was quiet. Polite. The kind of quiet that comes after something irreversible has happened, but no one wants to name it. My parents tried to act normal. My sister focused on her son. No one brought up the text, no one needed to. Afterward, my mother hugged me longer than usual. "I wish this hadn't gone this way," she said. "So do I replied. "But I don't regret it." That was true. I wasn't leaving angry. I wasn't leaving triumphant. I was leaving accurate. That mattered more than comfort. The morning I started packing in earnest, my sister stood in the doorway and watched. "You didn't have to make this so formal," she said. "I didn't have to make it informal either," I replied. She looked at the boxes, then back at me. "I didn't think you'd stand your ground." "I didn't think I needed to," I said. That was the moment it finally landed. Not as blame, as recognition. What she lost wasn't a roommate. It wasn't even the financial support, though, that stung. What she lost was the version of me who would absorb discomfort to make her life easier without question. As I taped the last box, I felt lighter than I expected. Not because the situation was resolved, but because it was no longer unresolved. Everything was out in the open now. Every cost accounted for, every assumption corrected. I carried the box to the car and set it in the trunk, then stood there for a moment, breathing in the quiet of a decision that was fully mine. Behind me, the house looked the same as it always had. Same walls, same driveway, same rooms. What had changed wasn't the place, it was who got to decide what leaving meant. I locked the door behind me and slid the key into my pocket without looking back. Not because I was trying to prove anything, but because there was nothing left inside that needed my attention. The boxes were already in the car. The paperwork was signed. The address on my mail had changed weeks ago. The drive to my new place took 12 minutes. It was closer to the base, smaller than my sister's house, and completely mine. No shared assumptions, no unspoken expectations. Just a clean lease, a set of keys, and silence that didn't feel heavy. I set the boxes down one by one, starting with the practical things. Uniforms, documents, kitchen basics. The rhythm felt familiar, almost comforting. I'd moved plenty of times before. The difference now was that this move wasn't dictated by orders or circumstances. It was a decision I'd made deliberately after refusing to be managed out of my own life. That first night, I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and ate takeout straight from the container. No table yet, no couch, just space. I realized I was smiling for no particular reason. At work, no one noticed a dramatic change. That was the point. I showed up the same way I always had. Focused, calm, reliable. But internally, something had shifted. The low-level tension I'd been carrying for years was gone. The kind you don't even realize is there until it isn't. A week later, the reimbursement agreement finalized. Funds transferred. Clean, professional. No apologies attached. My sister didn't fight it. She couldn't. The facts had already done their job. She sent one last message. "I hope you're happy." I read it, then set the phone down. I was. Not in a celebratory way. Not in the way movies portray revenge. There was no satisfaction in seeing her stressed or scrambling. The satisfaction came from something quieter, from knowing that I hadn't been erased, that my contributions hadn't vanished just because someone found them inconvenient. Family gatherings changed after that. I still showed up, so did she. The tone was different, polite, careful. No one pretended nothing had happened. No one brought it up either. The dynamic had reset whether anyone wanted to acknowledge it or not. My nephew adjusted quickly. Kids always do when adults stop pulling them into conflicts that aren't theirs. He asked if I liked my new place. I told him I did. He asked if he could visit. I said yes. End of discussion. At the base, I was selected for a leadership role that came with more responsibility and less margin for error. I accepted without hesitation. When the announcement went out, my sister congratulated me with a short text. No emojis, no extra commentary. "Congrats," she wrote. "Thank you," I replied. That was enough. Months passed. The distance between us settled into something sustainable. Not close, not hostile, just clear. I stopped being the backup plan. She stopped assuming my silence meant agreement. The family learned slowly that I wasn't going to smooth things over at my own expense anymore. One evening, after a long day, I came home and stood in my kitchen, looking around at the space I'd built from scratch. The furniture was simple, functional, nothing extravagant. Everything intentional. I thought back to the text that had started all of this, the finality of it. The assumption embedded in those few lines. "We've decided you need to move out." At the time, it felt like a dismissal. Now it felt like permission. Permission to stop negotiating my worth. Permission to stop proving I belonged. Permission to stop carrying arrangements that only worked when I stayed quiet. The revenge wasn't loud. There was no confrontation scene where everyone clapped or admitted they were wrong. The revenge was structural. It lived in boundaries, in documents, in choices that didn't require approval. My sister still lived in the same house. She still raised her son. Her life didn't collapse. It didn't need to. The point wasn't punishment. The point was correction. She learned that decisions made without me didn't get to use my resources, that narratives written about me didn't override facts, that I wasn't a supporting character in her story. And I learned something too. Being capable doesn't mean being expendable. Being adaptable doesn't mean being invisible. And staying quiet doesn't mean staying powerless, as long as you know when silence is strategy and when it's surrender. Some nights when I drive back from base, I pass the old neighborhood without thinking about it. The house blends in with the others now. No pull, no resentment, just a place I used to live. I don't wonder if things could have gone differently. They went exactly the way they needed to once I stopped trying to make them easier for everyone else. The text didn't force me out. It forced me to choose myself, and that choice turned out to be the most effective response I could have made. If you want to hear more real-life family revenge stories like this one told honestly and without sugarcoating, make sure you subscribe to the channel. New stories are coming, and they're worth staying for.